Homeless man keeps staring at a house when the owner confronts him. The truth is heartbreaking. For 3 weeks, Margaret Thompson had noticed the same homeless man standing across the street from her Victorian home on Elm Street, just staring at the house for hours at a time. At first, she had dismissed it as coincidence. Perhaps he was simply resting in the shade of the old oak tree that grew near the sidewalk. But as the days passed, Margaret realized that his presence was deliberate and consistent. The man appeared to be in his late 50s, with graying hair and clothes that had seen better days. He carried a worn backpack and seemed to favor his left leg when he walked, suggesting an old injury. What struck Margaret most was the expression on his face. As he gazed at her house, it wasn't the calculating look of someone planning a break-in, but something far more complex. There was longing in his eyes, mixed with a sadness so profound it made her uncomfortable to witness. Margaret was a 67-year-old retired librarian who had lived in the same ghetto house for 42 years. She had raised her 2 children there with her late husband Robert, and the home was filled with decades of memories and carefully preserved family treasures. The neighborhood had changed over the years, becoming more affluent, but Margaret had remained, finding comfort in the familiar surroundings and the garden she had lovingly tended for decades. Initially, Margaret's reaction to the homeless man's presence was fear and suspicion. She had heard stories about break-ins and property crimes, and having a stranger watching her house made her nervous. She began closing her curtains during the day and checking her locks multiple times before bed. She even considered calling the police, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the way the man never approached the house, never seemed threatening, just stood there looking with that heartbreaking expression of loss. On this particular Tuesday morning, as Margaret watered her prized rose garden, she noticed the man was back in his usual spot. But today was different. Today he wasn't just staring at the house, he was crying. Silent tears streamed down his weathered face as he stood motionless on the sidewalk, his gaze fixed on the front porch where Margaret had placed her late husband's favorite rocking chair. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't the behavior of someone with criminal intent. This was the behavior of someone in pain, someone for whom her house held significance that she couldn't understand. Setting down her watering can, Margaret made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She walked across the street, her heart pounding with nervousness and curiosity. As she approached, the man noticed her coming and seemed to panic, taking a step backward as if preparing to flee. "Please don't go," Margaret said gently, raising her hand in a peaceful gesture. "I'm not going to call the police. I just want to understand why you keep coming here." The man stopped, his eyes wide with surprise and fear. Up close, Margaret could see that despite his rough appearance, there was something familiar about his features, something that tugged at a memory. She couldn't quite place it. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I know I shouldn't be here. I'll leave and won't come back." "Wait," Margaret said, studying his face more carefully. "What's your name?" The man hesitated, as if debating whether to answer. Finally, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. David Thompson." Margaret felt the world tilt around her. Thompson, the same last name as hers, the same last name as her late husband's. As she looked more closely at the man's features, recognition began to dawn like a terrible sunrise. "Oh my God," she whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. "David, little David Thompson." The man David stared at Margaret with a mixture of recognition and shame flooding his features. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly, his voice breaking on her name. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." Margaret felt her knees go weak. David Thompson was her late husband's younger brother, the boy who had lived with them for 2 years when he was a teenager after their parents died in a car accident. Robert had been David's guardian, and this house, her house, had been David's home during some of the most formative years of his life. "Remember you," Margaret repeated, tears streaming down her face. "David, you lived here. This was your home, your family." But even as she said the words, Margaret was trying to reconcile the homeless man standing before her with the bright, ambitious teenager she remembered. David had been 17 when he came to live with them, devastated by his parents' death, but determined to finish high school and go to college. He had been like a son to Robert, and like a younger brother to Margaret. "What happened to you?" Margaret asked, her voice filled with concern and confusion. "We lost touch after you went to college, but I always I thought you were doing well." David's face crumpled with shame and regret. "I was, for a while. I graduated from State University, got a good job in engineering, got married, had kids. Everything was going according to plan." He paused, struggling to find the words to explain how his life had unraveled. But then things started falling apart. "I made some bad investments, lost a lot of money, started drinking to cope with the stress. My wife left me, took the kids, I lost my job, then my house. One thing led to another, and here I am." Margaret listened in horror as David recounted the series of events that had led to his homelessness. It was a story she had heard variations of before, how quickly a stable life could collapse when multiple crises hit at once. "How long have you been, ... Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. "On the streets, about 8 months now. I've been in the city for 3 weeks, trying to figure out how to get back on my feet. When I realized I was in the old neighborhood, I couldn't help myself. I had to see the house again. Margaret looked at David, really looked at him, and saw past the worn clothes and weathered appearance to the young man who had once sat at her kitchen table doing homework, who had helped Robert with yard work on weekends, who had been part of their family during a crucial time in his life. "Why didn't you come to the door?" Margaret asked. "Why didn't you let me know you were here?" David's expression was filled with shame. "Look at me, Margaret. I'm homeless. I'm dirty. I probably smell. I didn't want you to see me like this. I didn't want to burden you with my problems." "Burden me," Margaret repeated, her voice rising with emotion. "David, your family, you're Robert's brother. This house was your home." She paused, remembering something that made her heart ache even more. "You know, after Robert died 5 years ago, I used to wonder what happened to you. I tried to find you, but you had moved and I didn't know how to reach you. I always hoped you were happy, successful, living a good life." David wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm sorry about Robert. I should have been there for the funeral. I should have been there for you. You didn't know?" Margaret said gently. "And you're here now." They stood in silence for a moment, both of them processing the magnitude of this unexpected reunion. Margaret was struggling to understand how the promising young man she had known could have ended up homeless, while David was overwhelmed by shame and the fear that Margaret would reject him because of his circumstances. "David," Margaret said, finally, "when was the last time you had a proper meal?" David looked confused by the question. I don't remember. A few days ago, maybe." "And when was the last time you had a hot shower and slept in a real bed?" David's voice was barely audible. "Months." Margaret made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. "Come inside. Right now. You're coming home." David shook his head frantically. "Margaret, I can't. I'm not the same person I was when I lived here. I've made terrible mistakes. I've lost everything. I don't deserve your kindness." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," Margaret said firmly, taking David's arm. "Your family, and family takes care of each other. Robert would never forgive me if I let you stay on the streets when I could help." Leading David up the front steps of the house felt surreal to both of them. For Margaret, it was like welcoming home a ghost from her past. For David, it was like stepping back in time to a period of his life when he had felt safe, loved, and full of hope for the future. The house looked much the same as David remembered, though Margaret had made some updates over the years. The same family photos lined the hallway, including several pictures of David from his time living there, graduation photos, family dinners, holiday celebrations. Seeing these images of his younger self, surrounded by the love and stability that Robert and Margaret had provided, made David break down completely. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, covering his face with his hands. "I'm so sorry for what I've become. Robert believed in me, you both did, and I threw it all away." Margaret guided David to the living room and sat him down on the same couch where he used to do his homework as a teenager. "David, listen to me. You haven't thrown anything away that can't be rebuilt. You made mistakes, you faced challenges, but you're still the same person underneath." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water and a sandwich, watching as David ate with the desperate hunger of someone who hadn't had regular meals in weeks. "Tell me about your children," Margaret said gently, remembering that David had mentioned having kids. David's face lit up despite his tears. "2 kids, Emma and Michael. Emma's 15 now, Michael's 12. They're amazing kids, smart and funny and kind. They live with their mother in California. Do you stay in touch with them?" David's expression grew pained. "I try to, but it's complicated. Their mother remarried, and she thinks it's better if they don't know about my situation. She's probably right. What kind of father am I now?" Margaret felt her heart break for David's pain. She could see how much he loved his children and how much his separation from them was torturing him. "David, being homeless doesn't make you less of a father. It makes you someone who's going through a difficult time. Your children need to know that you love them, regardless of your circumstances." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret learned more about David's journey to homelessness. The engineering firm where he had worked for 15 years had been bought out by a larger company, and David had been laid off as part of the restructuring. At the same time, his investments in what he thought was a sure thing had turned out to be a scam, wiping out his savings and retirement fund. "I started drinking to cope with the stress and the shame," David explained. "At first it was just a glass of wine with dinner, then it was a bottle, then it was whatever I could get my hands on. My wife tried to help, but I was too proud to admit I had a problem." The drinking had cost David his marriage, his relationship with his children, and eventually his ability to find new employment. Without income and with mounting debts, he had lost his house and ended up on the streets. "I've been sober for 3 months now," David said, as if this might somehow redeem his story. "I finally realized that the drinking was just making everything worse." Margaret nodded, proud of David for taking that difficult step. "That's a huge accomplishment, David. Getting sober is one of the hardest things anyone can do." As evening approached, Margaret showed David to the guest room, the same room he had occupied as a teenager. She had kept it largely unchanged, with the same furniture and even some of his old books still on the shelves. "I can't stay here," David protested. "It's too much. You've already done more than enough." David G. Thompson, Margaret said in the same firm voice she had used when he was a teenager. You are staying here tonight, and we're going to figure out how to get your life back on track. That's what Robert would have wanted, and it's what I want. That night, as David lay in the bed where he had slept as a young man full of dreams and possibilities, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months: hope. Margaret's unconditional acceptance and love had reminded him that he was more than his mistakes, more than his current circumstances. Meanwhile, Margaret sat in her kitchen, looking through old photo albums filled with pictures of David during his time with them. She remembered the scared, grieving teenager who had arrived at their door, and how Robert had patiently helped him heal and grow. Now David needed that same kind of support again, and Margaret was determined to provide it. The next morning, Margaret woke to the smell of coffee and bacon coming from the kitchen. She found David standing at the stove, preparing breakfast with the same careful attention to details she remembered from his teenage years. I hope you don't mind, David said, looking slightly embarrassed. I wanted to do something to thank you for your kindness. Margaret smiled, touched by the gesture. I don't mind at all. It's nice to have someone to cook for again. As they ate breakfast together, Margaret began to outline a plan for helping David rebuild his life. She had spent much of the night thinking about practical steps they could take to address his situation. First, we need to get you some proper clothes for job interviews, Margaret said. Robert's clothes are still in the closet upstairs. You're about the same size he was. Then we need to work on your resume and start looking for employment opportunities. David listened with growing amazement as Margaret laid out a comprehensive strategy for his recovery. She had clearly put a lot of thought into this, approaching his problems with the same methodical intelligence she had brought to her work as a librarian. Margaret, I can't let you do all this for me, David protested. You're retired. You should be enjoying your golden years, not dealing with my problems. David, helping you isn't a burden, it's a privilege. You're the closest thing to family I have left. Besides, I've been rattling around in this big house by myself for 5 years. Having you here gives me purpose again. Margaret's words were true. Since Robert's death, she had been struggling with loneliness, in a sense that her life lacked meaning. Helping David gave her something important to focus on, a way to honor Robert's memory by caring for his brother. Over the following days, Margaret threw herself into David's rehabilitation with the same energy she had once brought to organizing library programs. She helped him update his resume, highlighting his engineering experience and skills while addressing the gap in his employment history, honestly but positively. We're not going to hide what happened to you, Margaret explained as they worked on his job applications. We're going to frame it as a period of personal challenges that you've overcome, which has given you new perspectives and resilience. Margaret also insisted that David see a doctor for a complete physical exam. Months of poor nutrition and sleeping rough had taken a toll on his health, and she wanted to make sure any medical issues were addressed before he started interviewing for jobs. You know, the doctor said after examining David, you're in remarkably good shape considering what you've been through. Your blood pressure is a bit high, probably from stress, and you're underweight, but nothing that can't be corrected with proper nutrition and care. The doctor also referred David to a counselor who specialized in helping people recover from addiction and homelessness. Margaret insisted on accompanying him to his first appointment, wanting to understand how she could best support his recovery. Mr. Thompson is fortunate to have such a strong support system, the counselor told Margaret after meeting with David. Many people in his situation don't have anyone to help them navigate the challenges of getting back on their feet. As David's physical and mental health improved, Margaret began to see glimpses of the confident, capable man he had once been. He started helping around the house, fixing small repairs that Margaret had been putting off and tending to the garden, with the same care he had shown as a teenager. You know, Margaret said one evening, as they worked together in the rose garden, Robert always said you had the best hands for gardening he'd ever seen. These roses haven't looked this good in years. David smiled, the first genuine smile Margaret had seen from him since his return. I always loved working in this garden. Some of my happiest memories from living here were the Saturday mornings when Robert and I would work out here together. He loved those times too, Margaret said softly. He used to say that gardening with you was like having the son he never had. David's eyes filled with tears. I miss him so much. I wish I could tell him how sorry I am for disappointing him. David, you didn't disappoint him. Life knocked you down, but you're getting back up. That's what Robert would have wanted to see. Not perfection, but resilience. Margaret's words were exactly what David needed to hear. For months, he had been carrying the weight of shame and self-recrimination, believing that his failures had somehow dishonored the memory of the man who had been like a father to him. 3 weeks after David's return to the house on Elm Street, Margaret received a phone call that would test both their resolve and their growing hope for the future. The caller was David's ex-wife, Jennifer, and she was not happy. Margaret, I heard that David is staying with you, Jennifer said, her voice tight with anger and concern. I need you to understand that he's not the man you remember. He's an alcoholic who abandoned his family. I don't want him anywhere near my children. Margaret listened calmly as Jennifer recounted her version of David's decline, understanding that this woman had been hurt deeply by David's addiction and the collapse of their marriage. But she also heard the pain and fear beneath Jennifer's anger. "Jennifer, I understand your concerns," Margaret said gently, "but David is sober now, and he's working hard to rebuild his life. Don't you think Emma and Michael deserve to know that their father is trying to get better?" "He's tried to get sober before," Jennifer replied bitterly. "He made promises before. I can't put my children through that disappointment again." After the call ended, Margaret found David sitting on the back porch, staring at the garden with an expression of profound sadness. He had heard enough of the conversation to understand what Jennifer had said. "She's right to protect them," David said quietly. "I did abandon them. I chose alcohol over my family, and now I have to live with the consequences." Margaret sat down beside him, choosing her words carefully. "David, you made mistakes, but you're not the same person who made those mistakes. You're sober, you're getting your life together, and you love your children. That should count for something. But how do I prove that to them? How do I show them that I've changed when Jennifer won't even let me talk to them?" Margaret had been thinking about this problem, and she had an idea that might help. What if we invited Jennifer and the children to visit, not to pressure them, but to let them see for themselves how you're doing? David looked at her with a mixture of hope and fear. "Do you think she'd agree to that?" "I think she might, if the invitation came from me. I'm a neutral party, someone she might trust to keep the children safe." Margaret called Jennifer back that evening, proposing a carefully structured visit that would allow the children to see their father in a safe, supervised environment. After much discussion and negotiation, Jennifer agreed to bring Emma and Michael for a brief visit the following weekend. The days leading up to the visit were filled with nervous preparation. David was terrified that his children wouldn't recognize him, or worse, that they would be afraid of him. Margaret helped him plan activities that might appeal to teenagers. A barbecue in the backyard, games they could play together, stories he could share about their family history. "What if they hate me?" David asked the night before the visit. "What if they can't forgive me for what I put them through?" "Then you'll deal with that," Margaret replied honestly. "But David, children are more forgiving than adults sometimes. They love their father, even if they're hurt and confused by what happened." When Jennifer's car pulled into the driveway that Saturday afternoon, David's hands were shaking with nervousness. Margaret stood beside him on the front porch, providing moral support as he prepared to face his children for the first time in over a year. Emma and Michael got out of the car slowly, clearly uncertain about what to expect. Emma, now 15, looked so much like her mother that David's breath caught in his throat. Michael, 12, had grown taller and looked more mature than David remembered. "Hi, Dad," Emma said quietly, her voice carefully neutral. "Hi, sweetheart," David replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've grown so much. You both have." The initial reunion was awkward and painful, filled with the weight of everything that had happened between them. But gradually, as the afternoon progressed, some of the old connections began to resurface. David showed them the room where he had lived as a teenager, sharing stories about their Uncle Robert and the family history they had never heard. "Uncle Robert taught me how to throw a curveball in this backyard," David told Michael as they tossed a baseball back and forth. "Maybe I can teach you too." Emma was more reserved, but Margaret noticed her watching her father carefully, as if trying to reconcile the man she remembered with the person standing before her. "Dad," Emma said finally, "are you really getting better? Are you really going to stay sober this time?" David knelt down to her level, looking directly into her eyes. "Emma, I can't promise you that I'll never make mistakes again, but I can promise you that I'm going to fight every day to be the father you deserve. I love you and your brother more than anything in the world, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for the time we've lost." 6 months later, David Thompson stood in the backyard of the house on Elm Street, watching his children play with the same joy and energy he remembered from their early childhood. Emma and Michael were visiting for the weekend, a regular occurrence now that Jennifer had begun to trust David's sobriety and commitment to rebuilding his relationship with his children. David had found a job with a local engineering firm, starting as a junior engineer despite his years of experience. The pay was modest, but it was honest work that allowed him to begin rebuilding his life and his self-respect. He had also started attending regular AA meetings and working with a sponsor who helped him maintain his sobriety. "Dad, watch this," Michael called out, attempting to throw the curveball that David had been teaching him. "Good form," David called back, beaming with pride at his son's improvement. Margaret watched the scene from her kitchen window, feeling a deep satisfaction at how much had changed since that day when she had first confronted David across the street. The broken, homeless man who had been staring at her house with such longing had been transformed back into the loving father and capable person she had always known he could be. "You know," Emma said, joining David on the back porch as Michael continued practicing his pitching. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I know it wasn't easy to get your life back together." David felt tears well up in his eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more to me than you'll ever know." "Are you going to keep living with Margaret?" Emma asked. David looked through the window at Margaret, who was preparing dinner for all of them. "For now, Yes, Margaret and I take care of each other. She needs someone to help around the house, and I need ... well, I need family. The arrangement had worked out better than either David or Margaret had anticipated. David paid rent from his salary, helping with Margaret's expenses while maintaining his dignity and independence. More importantly, they had become genuine companions, sharing meals, conversations, and the comfortable routine of a family. I've been thinking about something, David said to Margaret that evening, after the children had gone to bed. I want to start a support group for people who are trying to get back on their feet after homelessness. Use this house as a meeting place, if you're willing. Margaret's face lit up with enthusiasm. David, that's a wonderful idea. Robert would have loved that, using our home to help people who need support. David had been volunteering at the local homeless shelter, sharing his story and offering encouragement to others who were struggling with addiction and homelessness. He had discovered that his experience, painful as it had been, gave him unique credibility and insight that could help others. I keep thinking about all the people who are where I was 8 months ago, David explained. Sleeping on the streets, feeling hopeless, believing that they'll never be able to rebuild their lives. If I can show them that recovery is possible, that people can change, maybe I can make a difference. The support group that David and Margaret started in their living room grew quickly, becoming a beacon of hope for people throughout the community. David's story, from successful engineer to homeless addict to sober family man, inspired others to believe that their own situations could improve. The thing about rock bottom, David would tell the group members, is that it gives you a solid foundation to build on. When you've lost everything external, you discover what's really inside you. And sometimes, that's more than you thought. Margaret had found new purpose in supporting David's work, providing meals for the group meetings and offering her own perspective on the importance of family and community support in recovery. I learned something important from David's return. Margaret would tell the group, I learned that family isn't just about blood relationships. It's about choosing to love and support each other through the difficult times. One evening, as David was preparing for a group meeting, he found an old photo album that Margaret had put together, documenting his transformation. The first pictures showed him as he had looked when she found him on the street, thin, dirty, hopeless. The most recent photos showed him with his children, healthy and happy, surrounded by the love and support that had made his recovery possible. Look how far you've come, Margaret said, sitting beside him as he flipped through the album. We've come, David corrected gently. I couldn't have done any of this without you. Margaret, you saved my life when you decided to cross that street and talk to me. Margaret shook her head. I didn't save your life, David. I just reminded you that you were worth saving. You did the hard work of rebuilding yourself. As the support group members began arriving for their weekly meeting, David reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. The house that he had stared at with such longing from across the street had indeed been his salvation, not just because it provided shelter, but because it represented love, family, and the belief that people could overcome even the most devastating circumstances. Their story reminds us that home is more than just a building. It's a place where we are known, loved, and accepted for who we are, not what we have accomplished or failed to accomplish. It shows us that family bonds can survive even the most difficult challenges, and that sometimes the people who seem most lost are actually just waiting for someone to remind them of who they really are. Most importantly, it proves that redemption is always possible, that love can triumph over addiction and despair, and that sometimes the most profound healing happens when we choose to see past someone's circumstances to the person they can become again. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the power of unconditional love and second chances, please subscribe to our channel. We share stories of hope, redemption, and the incredible ways that families can heal and rebuild even after the most devastating losses. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of people who believe that everyone deserves compassion. That home is where the heart is, and that love really can conquer all.